Where'd you go, Bernadette? What does it mean to recommend? Part 1. The nature of recommendations. One day, I trekked through my library's used bookstore and found Where'd You Go, Bernadette? I had no specific book in mind. At the time, I needed a book, having finished one the night before, and that provided enough reason to purchase another. Tucked into a corner room on the left after entering the library, the used bookstore offers a curious assortment of literary ephemera. A small section labeled Classics covers part of the high school's required reading. The smaller Poetry section covers the other part. The rows for popular fiction hold familiar names with reprints from the 80s. I often find a Kuntz, but I rarely find a King. From the store, I have purchased a number of novels that I would consider random. Bernadette fits the mold. I do not remember what drew me to the novel. It could have been the teal color on the cover and spine, for I admit attractive packaging plays a role. The fact that I did not recognize the author, Maria Semple, drew my attention, curious to discover new authors. Regardless of the reason, I picked the novel from the shelf and read the synopsis and noted that Maria Semple had written for the TV show Arrested Development. I understand opinions for the show run favorably and towards the fanatic. I enjoyed the show when I had watched it in college, but I swear no allegiance to its greatness above any other show. Still, my enjoyment of the show and the novel's description inspired me to purchase it. After I read the book, I proudly added it to my library. I highly recommend the novel. I added it to my list of favorite novels, and it will probably always remain on that list. On a humorous note, I have recommended the novel to a number of people personally. These people had watched and enjoyed Arrested Development, and I framed my recommendation within that. However, none have read the novel. Bricks of not reading only sci-fi, and reading select fantasy novels that feature magical animals formed a wall against my recommendations. This does not stop my acquaintances from recommending books to me, though. When the people I know recommend books to me, they do so for what I consider misguided reasons. A friend of mine has recommended books to me because he had read them and wanted to discuss them with someone. This appears innocent, but makes no consideration for personal preference or for the quality of the book itself. One time, he recommended a book just so that he could complain about it to someone else who had read it. One of my brothers has recommended a helping of sci-fi and fantasy novels, which run the gamut of quality. I think he does this to convert me into a hard sci-fi lover. My other brother once recommended a book to me because, as he put it, I like boring books. Out of these recommendations, I have read some of the books. Sometimes I like them, sometimes I do not. My problem lies within the lack of how much these acquaintances read. They have not built up a large enough library to build comparisons. They think that a book deserves recommendation because they read it, that if they read a book, then the book must contain some intangible property that makes it noteworthy. I just wish my less literary, using the term to describe the art of putting words on a page, acquaintances would read more. Part 2. Recommendations as Review. I recommended Where'd You Go, Bernadette for two main reasons. The first, the book is hilarious. I have read a number of humorous books of different types. Some contain action stories with a bit of humor. Some focus on the humor, and then the plot happens to necessitate the humor. I have read absurdist stories where the humor seems to occur independent from the rest of the narrative. I have laughed at some of these books. Sometimes I have choked and gasped due to the laughter. Sometimes, however, I had rolled my eyes. When the joke hits, I groan or sigh. I nod along with the text, trying to move through it as quickly as possible. I admit I have not read the most humor in the world. Of the humor-centric authors I have read, I have only picked up other books by a few of them. I recognize the possibility that an even funnier author exists than those I have read. I also recognize the possibility of the inverse, where an author worse than those who I consider the worst exists. Humor comes from both the situations related from the narrative as well as the narrative voice. Some humor seems to come from absurd situations leading to an even more absurd situation. For example, take Worst Person Ever by Douglas Copeland, in which the protagonist bumbles through increasingly improbable situations. Sometimes, humor comes from the author's ability to construct a humorous metaphor or simile. I use John Dies at the End by David Wong as an example here, where, although the events elicit humor, most of the comedy comes from the narrator's voice. Of course, in the previous sentence, I use humor as a descriptor of genre rather than a statement of opinion. Whether or not one finds a subject funny depends on the subject. Bernadette contains both instances. A number of the events occurring in the novel prove hilarious on their face. For example, Bernadette Fox's house deteriorates throughout the novel. It starts out as a promising habitat that a little love and varnishing could improve. And then the reader learns that growing plant life under the house and excessive moisture causes doors to lock themselves, which then leads the characters to scatter in search of a solution. The humor of this situation would fit within any sitcom, especially in one of their bottle episodes. And, to the benefit of the novel, this comprises one part of the novel. Equally, if not better, episodes fill the rest of the pages. The book shows comical feuds between neighbors, uncool parents using neti pots, a backyard mudslide that gives school children a bit of excitement, and a call for PTSD counseling for the aforementioned landslide. All of this culminates in the greater episode that makes the reader wonder how someone would run away to Antarctica. I find it harder to describe the humor within the narrative voice. It does exist. I can say with confidence that any reader would find it. However, this humor relies less on absurd metaphors or similes. With John Dies at the End, I can easily point to the opening where the narrator gives a version of the Platonic philosophy quandaries of the grandfather's axe, in which the axe in question had killed a person, and now the zombified person questions the axe's existence. This stands clear, front and center within the narrative. With Bernadette, the narrative voice's humor depends more on the character, the problem of who said what. A joke or humorous section taken out of context might still cause humor, but it might not. This humor builds, sometimes over the course of the novel, into satisfying payoffs. I describe this style of humor as sarcastic. The mixture of funny situations partnered with sarcastic narrative reminds me of Arrested Development. The events of the show prove funny, but the addition of Ron Howard's narration adds another element that, as I believe, other shows have tried to replicate but come up short. Reading Bernadette felt like reading a season of Arrested Development, with enough difference to keep the novel fresh, unlike my personal experience with a number of sitcoms, and also to avoid unfair comparisons. Bernadette maintains the same style of humor without having to remind the reader of the show. With some parodies and allusions, I end up wanting the original. I did not experience this problem with Bernadette. As such, when I recommend this novel to people, I either preface or postscript my recommendation with the words, "If you liked Arrested Development, then you'll probably like this." The second reason I recommend the book comes from a simple origin. I find the story accessible and charming. The book's back cover relates the big plot points, including that the eponymous Bernadette vanishes and that her daughter believes the family's expectant Antarctic cruise holds the answer. I say the summary garners a decent amount of intrigue. I found it odd and quaint, but not outside the realm of plausibility. It helped convince me to purchase the book, and I think it would help others decide favorably. However, the novel contains more than just a cruise to Antarctica. The novel spotlights a family of successful parents, their smart, curious daughter, and a dog. People laud Bernadette for her achievements in architecture. A previous building of hers receives both expository attention and attention from the characters. Now, knowing that an artist's worth resides within their latest creation, Bernadette searches for a bigger, better project. To that end, she turns her attention to a dilapidated manor that once cut an attractive silhouette atop its hill. Elgin, Bernadette's husband and tech genius, works at Microsoft, which necessitates the family living in Seattle despite Bernadette's distaste for the region. A TED Talk of his, which demonstrated a small portable device that allows a person to control various household gadgets through thought while lazing in a chair, circulates throughout the characters. Often, when a character mentions Elgin, they also mention that his TED Talk has become the most successful TED Talk in history. He, of course, has to balance emerging and life-changing technology, veiled by the conceit that it will benefit mankind, with the smaller scope duties of raising a family. B, their daughter, observes her family. She relates what she loves about her parents and what she wishes they wouldn't do. She does well in school, shows a healthy degree of curiosity, and excels. She proposes that the family takes a cruise to Antarctica as a reward for her perfect grades. Meanwhile, Audrey, whose child goes to the same school as B, starts a petty feud with Bernadette. The feud spirals into a series of humorous but also worrying incidents. The family unit suffers, Bernadette and Elgin's marriage takes on more stress than it can handle, questions of mental instability arise. At some point, hackers make an appearance. I have not covered everything, nor will I. A lot happens within the pages, and a lot of characterization occurs. To represent everything, I could talk for hours. I believe reading the novel would give the best representation of the novel. Part 3. Final thoughts. When it comes to my enjoyment of novels and stories, I have no set standard. I may prefer one type of story to another, but I try to read as much different material as possible. My parents used to devour mystery books, especially those by Robert P. Parker. My dad told me he liked that each of the novels followed a specific pattern. According to him, few details changed from one novel to the next. He liked the familiarity. He knew he would enjoy the next novel since he had enjoyed the previous. He and my mom knew what they wanted from a story. Some people criticize this practice. I used to, but have changed my mind since then. Now, I appreciate the worth of familiarity and the worth of just enjoying a story. I also appreciate the difficulty of pleasing myself. With no set standard, I usually rely on authors. If I enjoy a work by a particular author, then I find value in the author's other works, disregarding the qualifiers of like or dislike. Barring that, as is the case with new authors or authors I have newly discovered, I take each work on a case-by-case basis. One story may end with a happy ending, and I may like that, but the next happy ending I come across might make me groan. A type of character might work within one framework, it might fail within a different one. Someone looking at me and my opinions might encounter confusion. They might not find the thread which I follow. Even when it comes to definitive works I like, my opinions veer into weird directions. My mom once asked what my favorite Ray Bradbury book was. I told her Something Wicked This Way Comes. She then asked why I thought that was the best. I told her I do not consider it the best, just my favorite. I then had to explain the difference between favorite and best. Recommendations come cheap. Many people have recommended books to me on the basis of, I read a lot of books. I do not fault people, especially my friends and family, for not having read as much as me, as well as not having the same discerning eye. But I wish they would take a little more effort. They could ask me which books I like and why. I would gladly explain to them, since I love talking about books, and I especially love talking about the books I love. When I recommend some material to someone, I make the choice based off of a connection. I try to put thought and effort into the recommendation. I do the same for Bernadette. If you like Arrested Development, if you like comedies, if you like light-hearted romps, or if you want to take a break from the oppressing nature of pessimistic stories filled with death and despair, then you should check out Where'd You Go, Bernadette? This is just test audio. That is all. This has been Bennett Durkin, and this has been an essay from my library.